Hello and welcome. My name is Gabriel Merrithew, and this is my first ever film podcast. We're going to be talking about why I love movies, some of my favorite genres, and a couple of movie examples. And we're just going to talk about what I think about them. This is my first ever podcast, and you got to start somewhere. So let's get to it. So I am a self-proclaimed film nerd. I'm a film buff, and sometimes I forget after I don't watch movies for a while, why do I love films? Why do I put so much time into watching films? I mean, what's so great about films? And then I watch a great film and suddenly all my faith is restored. I recently watched Midsummer, which was eye-opening because I hadn't watched a movie in about 3 weeks. College is a busy life. What Ari Aster is doing behind the camera and how he directed Midsummer is really inspiring to someone like me because this is only his second feature film and he already has a captive audience that's going to be there for everything he does from now on, myself included. But the line between mainstream and art house horror is often blurred because we have what are art house horror films that have been given higher budgets than they have in the past, especially by the film production company A24. They've been producing a lot of really great art house horror movies, and I'm not even sure if we can call them art house horror anymore because they're certainly artsy and they have lots of metaphors and ambiguity, and some people hate them for that. I mean, they're very polarizing for audiences. You either hate them or you love them at this point. I'm definitely in the category of love them. I really appreciate having to think through a movie. I just love a movie that's thought-provoking and you are thinking about it long after the credits roll. Whereas a lot of the mainstream horror, it's fun. Most of the time you can see all the horror tropes and cliches coming, being released out of that tension-filled state by a loud noise or a jump scare. I don't believe that's what horror movies are about. If you're constantly being released from that tension, then what's the point? Some viewers take pride in being able to predict what happens in a movie, and this is especially true with mainstream horror. All the tropes and cliches they're all there, and they all follow a recognizable pattern, and so when you're sitting there in the theater with your friends and you all know exactly when that monster is going to be in the back of the frame, viewers of mainstream horror take pride in the fact that they can predict when that monster is going to appear in the back of the frame, and the characters aren't going to realize it's there, and then there's going to be a loud jump scare noise, usually high-pitched shrill, and you jump because you are startled by the loud noise, not the monster. That's where I don't think that horror movies are living up to their full potential. That's cheap horror. You're not scared by the images on screen. You're not scared by the theme that's being relayed. With films like Midsummer, it's harder to predict what's going to happen next. In fact, when I watched it, it was near impossible for me to predict anything. Midsummer constantly kept me on my toes, and Ari Aster, the themes that he chooses for his films, grief, from Hereditary, really diving into the family dynamic of how grief affects you and how mental illness that's passed down through generations it can be scarring to members of your family, and when certain things happen, you'll never be the same again. And he continued with themes of grief in Midsummer. Mild spoilers here. I don't actually consider this to be a spoiler for Midsummer because it never really is explained why this sequence was shown. In the beginning of the movie, Danny, played by Florence Pugh, her sister sends her an email with a disturbing message, and later on that night she finds out that her sister had killed her parents, or their parents, in a murder-suicide. I expected that scene to be explained later as to why they included it. The only reason I can think of as to why the murder-suicide scene was put in the beginning of Midsummer was because audiences needed that visceral imagery to understand the depth of Dani's grief, and how later on, when she is accepted into this pagan cult, she goes along with their beliefs and even partakes because she just needs to feel like she belongs somewhere, like she has a support system, the support system that she lost when her parents were killed. As soon as she can no longer rely on Christian, her boyfriend, to support her, she welcomes the belonging and caring nature of these pagans who have different beliefs than she does in the beginning, but because she feels accepted, she's willing to adopt them. Now, I would like to talk about a couple examples of mainstream versus art house horror. One of the best mainstream horror films, in my opinion, which is Insidious, which remains to this day to be one of the most scary experiences I've ever watched. And it was done in a way that had a lot of these same horror cliches that we talked about, but it isn't predictable. And the scares are real. James Wan, who directed Insidious, he knows when to show you something and when to not show you something. So you know that whenever you hear that loud noise and the jump scare happens with all the tight cuts, he actually has something to show you, and it's going to be disturbing. It always has a purpose. There are no scares just for the sake of being scares, which I can't say about all of his films, but Insidious I consider to be one of, if not his best. Throughout the whole runtime, I was not predicting what would happen next. I was wrapped up in a story that was simple yet compelling, and the supernatural elements didn't feel forced as they do with some others. There are obviously similarities between a lot of his films. The Conjuring, for example. A lot of the same cliches take place, and as soon as you've seen one James Wan movie, you have a pretty good idea of what to expect from the rest. So, why I was so frightened by Insidious, which is, in my opinion, a mainstream horror movie, was because of the tension between the family members as their son is being possessed by this evil, this force of evil. And throughout the whole movie, there is a sense of impending doom, and there's this palpable dread in the air as this family completely unravels over this supernatural occurrence in their home. That it's also not a haunted house movie. It's not their home that's haunted by this evil presence. It's their son. And one of my greatest fears is something inside me hurting me that I can't get out. If I have a severe illness or some sort of infection or parasite, that's not something you can run away from. It's going to be on you. It's going to be a part of you until you can convince it to go away or kill it. There's a sense of claustrophobia, being claustrophobic because you are trapped inside your own body, and when your body is infected by evil, there's no way to get away from it. You get the James Wan horror trope, the woman who is a paranormal investigator, ghost hunter. It's a horror trope that's in The Conjuring as well, where she comes to the house and tries to summon this presence, convincing it to reveal itself to them. And Patrick Wilson's character has to go into this alternate reality where his son is being held captive by this evil presence. And the cinematography in particular, when he is in this upside-down-esque space, it's refreshing for a horror movie. You get a lot of wide shots, you get a lot of really clear images, which is unexpected for what is essentially very similar to a dream sequence. He's walking throughout his own house, but in this alternate reality, and everything in the shot is very dark, and it's hard to see what's in the corners in the frames. But luckily, James Wan utilizes light very sparingly in this sequence, where the light will shine directly on what you're supposed to be scared of. So as long as you look for what's being illuminated, you will see everything. And as soon as you realize that, it does become a little bit predictable, but it's refreshing in that you have these longer shots. There aren't any rapidly cut sequences where you don't actually see what's happening. So Insidious is what I would call a highly effective mainstream horror movie. Then you have Arthouse horror, which I would consider Ari Aster to be an Arthouse horror director. Then you have The Killing of a Sacred Deer, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, which is very much so an Arthouse horror film, which relies heavily on great performances, super long takes of disturbing things happening, and relies heavily on great performances by his actors, some of whom are straight up psychopaths with very unnatural tendencies that are antiseptic feeling and stale, which is reinforced by the very, very sharp angles in the hospital where the father works. So those are two examples of mainstream and art house horror, which I obviously have a lot of opinions on. I don't appreciate how we have a trend of very poor quality horror films coming out every year, because they are incredibly cheap to make, and if you put them in the theaters at the right time, you will automatically get lots of people flocking to the theater to go see this horror movie because of the time of year. If it's released around Halloween, if it's released on Friday the 13th, or if the theme or the plot has something to do with a holiday or something, like Krampus, a Christmas horror movie. I mean, a lot of these films, just because of when they are placed in theaters, they automatically make back their budget tenfold. It discourages studios from wanting to invest in these art house horror films, because they are not going to be as watchable to all audiences. They are not going to be as watchable to all audiences. They will be very polarizing and disturbing, because a lot of people will either find these psychological elements to be very disturbing, or they will get bored by the slow burn effect that a lot of these art house horror films have, and they'll walk out of the theater and tell their friends, who will stay away from a film that they probably won't enjoy because they aren't art house horror film fans. So going back to Midsummer, which was a very refreshing film experience, I did not get a chance to see it in theaters. I wish I had. I really wish I had gone and seen that in theaters, which was the same actually for Hereditary. But I was just too afraid to watch Hereditary after seeing some of the ominous promotional material, and I thought it would be much more mainstream than it actually was when I eventually saw it. But what was so intriguing to me about Midsummer, and why I was really pulled into the story, was actually because of personal experiences. Some of the pagan rituals and routines that this isolated community had are straight out of what was my Waldorf education. We dressed up in white robes and danced around a maypole. We made crowns out of flowers, that we could find in the weeds, and we made food together from scratch. We ground our own grains to make bread, And it wasn't because we had to, it was because it was tradition for our Waldorf school. They didn't force the beliefs on us or these traditions, but we were expected to partake. And I think that's the difference between paganism and the Waldorf education system, is that in my Waldorf school education experience, I wasn't forced to believe anything. Yet, if I wanted to make the most of my experience and get along with the staff there, it was in my best interest to partake in these activities as fully as possible. And don't get me wrong, there was nothing twisted going on at Waldorf School like there was in Sweden, in this pagan community from Midsummer. It was all very peaceful. All the beliefs were very peaceful. But I found similarities in how when we would step out of line as students, the teachers had zero tolerance for any sort of rule breaking. And so naturally, I developed a habit of breaking these rules. And the consequences were, none of them were violent, but they were all very psychologically scarring. I was made to feel bad about myself and to feel shame, especially later on. Now, what struck me most about Midsummer was how this community of isolated pagans, their beliefs were all peaceful in their mind. And simply because they believed their actions, beliefs, their traditions to be peaceful, they became peaceful to them. To them, they weren't doing anything wrong. In fact, they were doing everything very right, by the book of their religion. And so they didn't feel any shame in sacrifices. They didn't feel any shame in these, what we would consider needlessly heinous deeds, because they were all done in the interest of maintaining the peace in their small society. Now I'd like to briefly discuss the 2017 film Thoroughbreds, directed by Corey Finley. This movie recently made its way onto my top 10 favorite films of all time. And it made it on my list for a very specific reason, which I will get into. Now, Thoroughbreds is interesting because they pinpoint the theme in the promotional material. In the trailer, you get large text on the screen that says Lily feels everything and Amanda feels nothing. Now, what was interesting to me about Thoroughbreds was that as I watched it, about 15 minutes in, I was spellbound, because every single decision that the director made on how to structure the film and the decisions that the characters make within the film, they were all exactly, I felt, what I would have chosen those decisions to be if I were the one directing. And it blew my mind because I'd never seen anything like that, where I thought to myself, that's how I would have directed that film. That's how I would have directed that scene. And I'd never seen anything like that. Now, I've only told a couple people that I have added Thoroughbreds to my top 10 list. My current top 10 list, which is on my film review Instagram page, that's no longer, it's been updated since I posted that. And the reason I haven't told many people that Thoroughbreds has made it onto my top 10 is because I don't think that it is necessarily an intelligent decision for someone who is a film buff. I think that there are definitely better films out there, but that's not what the list is called. That's not what the list is for. It's my favorite films. It's the films that impacted me emotionally on a level that no other films do. There are certainly better films. I mean, the fact that I don't have films like Pulp Fiction, Aliens, The Shawshank Redemption, or any of these other just amazing films. I mean, The Godfather, it's not on my top 10. That's a phenomenal movie, almost flawless. If not completely flawless at this point. It's achieved a status that very few films have. And it's not on my top 10, yet Thoroughbreds, a directorial debut, is. And that's because it impacted me on a level that very few films have. 7 to be exact, because it's at number 8. It's the 8th most emotionally impactful film that I've seen. And it's because of the theme. It's because of an incredibly entertaining story that is equally genius. We have these two extreme ends of the spectrum of emotion. While Amanda feels absolutely nothing throughout the entire runtime, despite a shocking ending scene, I don't believe she feels anything at all, even during that scene. But Lily, on the other hand, in the beginning, yes, she feels everything, and she overreacts. Her emotions are running wild. And yet, by the end, she pushes away some of her emotions that will only mentally cripple her. She is driven and motivated, and her emotions just keep getting in the way of that. The fact that they led her to kill her stepfather is proof that that was a stupid decision, and definitely the situation could have been handled better. But she let her emotions get the best of her. I don't think that she regrets that decision, but she knows that these deep emotions, they're mentally crippling to her, and she will simply not get as much done if these emotions are in the way. So she learns from Amanda and starts selectively choosing which emotions to portray to the world and which to let affect her deep down. Now, before we move on to my absolute favorite film of all time that I'd like to discuss briefly, I want to say that this is my very first film podcast. Like I said, it's going to take about 500 shitty takes to get to something where I feel like I'm in my groove and my thoughts are strung together nicely. I'm very much inspired by people like Chris Stuckman and other podcasters who are able to convey their thoughts so nicely on film and audio and maintain their captive audience. And they do it out of their passion for the craft. And I have a passion for films. I don't see that passion subsiding. And so we're gonna keep going with this, and this is gonna become something awesome. So I hope you are here for the ride. I'd love to have you. Now on to my number one favorite film of all time, Leon the Professional, or Leon as it was originally released as, is directed by Luc Besson and stars Jean Reno and Natalie Portman. And I'm not going to get too deep into it because it is a well-known film with a cult following, but it is my favorite film for one reason alone, and that is the relationship between Matilda and Leon, which is absolutely unexpected in an action film. It is an action film, but it's an action film with heart. The relationship between Matilda and Leon is ever-changing, but every single time it evolves. The misstep, as you could say, with Matilda's character thinking that she's in love with Leon and wanting him to be her lover at age 12, is deterring for some audiences, but I think that whole dynamic is misunderstood because she's not looking for a lover. She's looking for someone who will support her and love her and show her more affection than Leon is currently showing her. So she is just trying to get his attention. In the end, Leon dies, and Matilda is left with nothing but their potted plant, which they care dearly for, especially Leon. It had been his family for a long time, and he took very good care of it, and it was the only thing that she had left of him. And so when she buried that plant in the ground so that it could have roots, that was just a very touching scene. And I'd say I've seen Leon about 5 times only, because I don't watch it that often, because I like to have the full effect, that psychological strain that it puts on you as you see these people being pulled together and then ripped apart. It's emotionally scarring, yet incredibly beautiful. And for that reason, it's the number one pick on my top 10 all-time favorite movies. So I recently moved here to Wisconsin from North Idaho. I'm currently in Madison, which has been amazing. I've been here for about a year, and a lot of unique opportunities have come my way, and I've become a lot more driven because of the expectations and the hustle and bustle and the execution that's happening around me. I'm surrounded by a lot of very driven people, and I'm trying to spend as much time with them as possible so that I can rub off on them and they can rub off on me. And where I came from in North Idaho, a small town called Sandpoint, I left there because there was no reason to be motivated. I wasn't going to go anywhere. I was comfortable. I was happy in a shallow way, happy in the moment, going boating in the summer and skiing in the winter, riding the motorcycle up the windy mountain roads. I mean, I was having a blast, and I had friends that I would go on adventures with, and I wasn't getting anything done. And so coming here to Wisconsin and being in the city has really been eye-opening, because I have been in the ideation stage of innovation for so long. I've always had grand plans, but execution has always been very hard for me. And so that is my goal for this podcast right now, is to start executing. The first step of execution happened about this time last year when I started my Instagram account for film reviews. I think I have about 15 or 16 reviews up on there right now. Not a whole lot, but it was a chance to prove to myself that I could actually produce something of value that related to my passions. It's not profitable yet. I'm not even sure if I will continue with it, because I don't like the idea of being a film critic forever. In fact, I have respect for a few film critics, but overall, I'd like to be the one directing and the one behind the camera, and not the one critiquing what other people do while they sit there not executing on their passion for films. And so with that being said, I have started writing my very first screenplay called The Ibis. I am still in somewhat of an ideation stage, but I do have pages upon pages of random scenes and ideas and theme deconstruction or inspiration from other films that I'd like to adapt. And it's all a tangled mess right now, but I am really excited about what I have so far. And I read one of the scenes the other day that I had written about a month ago, and I just read it and thought to myself, wow, this is brilliant, this is fucking brilliant. And I am really excited to get the ball rolling here. I'm going to finish my screenplay here soon, hopefully. I need to obviously create a timeline so that I get this finished. But my podcast is also just here to help me stay accountable. And if there are other film lovers out there watching these videos, I'd love to build some connections with you all. We're all hopefully here for the love of film, and I would love some like-minded people to help me stay accountable, and I think that I can produce something really amazing here shortly once I get my screenplay off the ground, and I'd love to network with some people who are doing the same kind of things, who are very driven, because you are who I want to be like. Now, my focus for my screenplay, The Ibis, is isolation and mental illness. I'm not going to dive too deep into the plot of The Ibis, but I will say that it's about 4 young adults in their early 20s who live together in a large estate called the Ibis in a remote mountain village, and there may or may not be a psychopath amongst them, or in many ways they're all a little bit psychopathic, and the isolation is affecting them in different ways, and their friendship is tested as these truths come pouring out, and they realize that they don't really know each other as well as they think they do. Now, one thing Now, one idea that I had the other day that I'm still going back and forth on as to whether it was a good idea or not was I picked my ideal cast for my film. I'm not going to share who it is right now. I'll get into that later once I've developed the ideas a little bit more. But I'm wondering if it was a good idea to write characters with a specific actor or actress in mind. And whatever you think, please let me know. And if you have any other strategies for story writing, even if it's not a screenplay, let me know, and I'd love to network. So overall, The Ibis is a dark comedy character study with the theme of isolation. And I have been whiteboarding a lot, trying to figure out what my film is going to be and trying to focus on developing characters, because I know that my favorite films are ones that I really care about the characters. And so if I can flesh out these characters within a traditional runtime, I will be very pleased. And another thing that intrigues me, how far will you go to maintain a friendship with someone who is doing something that goes against your values, that is morally wrong? If that person is your friend, will you help them? Will you help them get through what they're going through, even if you could be considered an accomplice? That is something that I'd like to study in The Ibis. So, thank you very much for watching. It's probably just me going to be watching this, but thank you to myself. And if this ever gets uploaded anywhere, thank you so much for watching. I will be doing more podcasts in the future, trying to get a weekly schedule going. I covered a lot of different things in a shallow way throughout this podcast, and I'd love to dive deeper into some of the things said here today. I have a lot of films that I'd like to talk about, specifically in the Arthouse horror genre. So I'm super excited to continue with these podcasts/videos, and I will keep you posted on Instagram as to when the next one will be coming out, and hopefully we can come up with a consistent schedule here soon. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.